So I've got about 12 themes I want to pick Mike's brain on. And I wanted to start with what is the real value of having a collaboration? I mean, it's easy for us to work independently. So what's the value that a collaboration brings to the research journey?
Look, trying to unpack that on some several different levels here, which I think is kind of important. Obviously, there's the value that comes in from having a wider network, right? As we begin our PhD journey, or whatever stage of your PhD journey in, you'll find actually your depth of knowledge is increasing, but surprisingly, your breadth of knowledge kind of also decreases as well. So there's this kind of inverse relationship, and that's part of the process, right? To earn that doctorate degree or whatever, you really need to demonstrate an in-depth knowledge of a particular area. And often we become very siloed in our disciplines. And this prevents us from doing really good, impactful research. So if we kind of think about all those impactful research that does tend to go on there, and many sort of funding bodies and all of this nowadays call for greater interdisciplinary research. So there's real value in collaborating with people, whether it be academics or non-academics or even practitioners. In fact, there's this whole variety of different collaborations that you get. It sort of unlocks those interdisciplinary doors and expands the mind horizons. But also it serves, I think, as a way of naturally complementing your own skills or even deficiencies. So collaborators can help you see new information which you haven't seen before, obviously. It can point you into new disciplinary areas or subdisciplines within a particular area that you may have ignored or are ignoring as part of your PhD process. But it could also expose you to new ways of interpreting and even analyzing the data that you have, and maybe even reformulating how you think about your critical research questions. So that's one aspect of it as well. There's also the aspect of actually just good networking, right? A good collaboration allows greater visibility. And I find over time, a good collaborator also acts as a strong internal source of motivation for you. Because when we collaborate with people, we want to actually raise or rise to their level and standard. So one of the things I look for in good collaborations is to continuously try and find people not necessarily so much so at your level, but those that are a bit higher that can stretch you. And this has some important implications because they may see what you're doing from a different light and say, hey, maybe you can submit to a higher level journal, or maybe you can go for this type of grant funding, and these doors might have, in your mind, been closed off because you might say, I'm too new, I don't have any experience. But a collaborator can sort of bring that experience to you. Also, it is about like I said, creating greater visibility within your discipline and also outside of your discipline. More people will read your work and recognize the value of what you do when you have a broad collaborative range. So there's multitudes and multiple levels. And people enter into collaborations for many different reasons. It's not just to sort of produce a paper, but I think you have to think about how a paper might be produced or how a piece of research may be produced. So a collaborator may bring methodological experience. They may bring, let's say, theoretical experience that you may not have. Sometimes they may bring even writing experience. They may help clarify what you've written and expand on it as well. So there's different ways that a collaborator can come in. Sometimes collaborators can also be a sort of temperature check in the room for you, right? To see how your thought processes are going, whether they're going in the right direction or not, or could they be steered into another direction. So there's many different value emanating from having collaborations.
So who who should we be collaborating with? Because you sort of touched upon that a little bit in terms of looking for somebody who's perhaps at a different level to yourself, and that being a skill development for you, but also as a PhD candidate or an early career academic, what are the different types of people or organizations that we should be looking to collaborate with?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll just sort of put a caveat onto what I said earlier. I put it in the context of getting your work published and whatever. But collaborations should, and there's nothing wrong with occurring across the board. So, I mean, I feel that there are sort of certain limitations with maybe collaborating with other PhD students. Okay, I think there may be some difficulties down the road and in the process because of that, but collaborating on a new piece of research may be more appropriate for that. There's definitely value in collaborating with practitioners, right? Often much of the research that we do is bogged down in theoretical considerations, but a lot of journals now and a lot of scholarship is moving to this idea of how do we bridge the theory practice gap? And that can only bridged, or is best bridged, when you actually collaborate with people in industry or people with practitioners. And collaborations may also extend across institutions, right? And that may be simply to gain access to resources or other expertise in a particular area. But also when I say institutions, this not only includes academic institutions, but things like NGOs as well and government. Because when you collaborate with government organizations, you see a very different system in place to your own institution or your own way of working, because they have different requirements to work with. Same thing with NGOs and even with private enterprise. Collaborating is very different. There are much more complicated rules about how you may do a piece of research, how you report that piece of research, because things like confidentiality and privacy become much more important, and data protection and all those. So these are things that may not necessarily you may think about in your own PhD journey, but when you start that collaboration process, these things come into play. And I think collaborating with these different people and types of organizations actually exposes you to a lot of that as well.
We often think about collaborations as being leading to publication only. Is that always the case? Are there other ways in which we can look at how or why a collaboration may be formed?
No, and I think we have to sort of get out of that mindset, right? Collaboration should be for multiple purposes. And this includes applying for grants, right? Applying for funding. So I know, like in Malaysia and elsewhere in like other countries, situation may be different, but my own experience in Malaysia, Singapore, and Australia, your success for getting a grant is significantly enhanced if you have a institutional collaboration in place, so joint application. And it locks those doors as well. It also unlocks opportunities for you and elsewhere. A collaboration can help you enter what I sometimes call a difficult to access population. So for example, if you are looking at trying to do some research around social entrepreneurs or marginalized groups or something like that, having a collaborator from that group gives you additional voice and credibility and helps to overcome some of the legitimacy so you can open up into other doors as well. And simply, in other ways, collaboration in the more sciencey types of fields is a way of minimizing risk, really, in gaining access to those kind of resources. And you'll see, like I said before, a lot of institutions are encouraging collaboration, not only between academics internationally, but between academics and industry and different forms of industry as well.
I think if I can add also to there, collaboration for the purpose of data collection certainly works in an industry academic collaboration. Partly to do with access, but partly also just to meet certain needs that have different outputs with respect to that. So let's sort of move on to what a collaborative effort looks like, because there's a lot of differences in there. I know that. But what does a collaboration look like? You know, it's not two people sitting down doing equal amounts of work all the time, is it?
No, and let me roll that back a little bit. So I think before we answer that, what does a collaboration look like? We have to understand that the collaboration process is a learning process. You will most likely stuff up your first one and stuff it up gloriously. But that's okay. The more you engage in collaboration and the more you collaborate with people from different disciplines and even internationally, you find a process that works for you and works for the group that you are collaborating with. And these processes will be different and the expectations will be different between, let's say, collaborating with your supervisor, collaborating with your supervisor's supervisor, which sometimes happens, or even collaborating with other academics. The first, I guess, the first way to think about that is that your natural source of collaboration would kind of be your supervisor or something like that. And that's a very interesting collaboration because I find that as a hard, personally, I find that is quite difficult to think of as a collaboration because I think of it already as a pre-existing relationship. In most situations, you'll find that you've done a lot of the work and you would have said everything, and your supervisor may sort of come in at specific moments and adapt or change things so that they can suit expectations. And most of my experience and practices differ across the world. And I leave it into their own respective countries and institutions to think about that. But for example, here in Malaysia and observed in some parts of Asia, collaboration means that you put your supervisor's name on every piece of work that you produce. And that's just sort of the accepted norm. Whether that person actually does anything or not is again up to you. Whereas in places like Australia, that is very much frowned upon. And so a supervisor would have to have significant input into the process. So they may be writing, editing, analyzing, or whatever, and then they would put. So we can talk about, you know, where co-authorship goes and all that is a little bit different. But again, it's about, and then collaborating with a new person who might be in your own discipline but from another institution. That you start off with from the very basic beginning, right? So you are discussing a topic and then you find some mutual common ground, or you think that there is some opportunity here to sort of explore something jointly, or it may be that, you know, collaborations might work in a situation, say, like this. I mean, I'll just give you a recent example between myself and working with our Ningbo campus is that we had a visit and we found out that both of us have a interest or growing interest in the area of social entrepreneurship. And what had happened is that recently I had collected some data as part of a project about social entrepreneurs in Africa, but I'd never really got to analyzing it or thinking about it. So we said, hey, look, we can actually form a collaboration here, right? Where we're trying to achieve similar objectives. They were keen on the topic. So at this stage, we said, well, here's the data. You can go off and explore it because you have that skill and ability to explore data much more than I have quantitative data. And that's what she's doing now. So our process with that would typically mean that she explores the data and says, look, we've got some interesting things. Yes, studies can go ahead, or no, we probably needed to collect some more. And then we'll go off and hopefully write a manuscript or two around that as well. Others can be more embryonic than that and say, we've got an idea, but we really need to start data collection and stuff like that and explore it and then develop the idea from there. So there's, have I answered your question there, Craig? I'm not sure.
Pretty much. I mean, welcome to continue.
Yeah. They can take sort of many different forms in that sort of sense. Now I've lost track of what the question was actually. Can you repeat the question?
What does a collaboration look like? I mean, you have addressed it
Yeah, so
in a lot of ways, actually. I think
I
that's yeah.
just to add to that, it's what ultimately you and the collaborators envisage what a collaboration actually looks like. So collaboration may not actually result sometimes. We often think about collaborations resulting in something, but collaborations could just simply result in intellectual pursuits. So that is thought together and discussion. So that is something that I'm doing right now because I have a genuine interest in entrepreneurial activity in emerging economies. So I had the chance to sort of, on another forum, meet some academics who are from Latin America. And we have just been agreeing that we are going to collaborate and start talking once a month on what we think is research is interesting or what we've read and research. I mean, that's more of a group, I guess. But the intent is that we are working towards building those bonds initially because we want to know what we're getting ourselves into, right? So with any collaboration, we have to think about what can the person deliver or what are we expecting from this collaboration? Are we, often, and even in my own career, and I can see along my own colleagues, we go to a conference or we meet someone and we start talking, we get really excited and passionate and have this grand collaboration idea, only to discuss it again the next time we meet 12 months down the road and in another conference and nothing kind of really materializes. Okay, so you have these many different sort of collaborations in name, and sometimes collaborations in thought, and collaborations in practice as well. So these are the different types of collaborations that I would see. So I guess my point to answering your question is that it takes on many different forms, and with each collaborator, it will have a different form. And I think there's no stock standard answer to this question. And it's what I'm trying to sort of emphasize here.
That's cool. And there's kind of two questions I want to follow up with, and I'm not sure which one to go first now.
So
I've got a number of friends who creatures of habit. They tend to collaborate with the same small circle all the time. And I could name a couple of people who haven't changed in 20 years. Same little circle of 3 to 4 collaborators. Yet others like yourself are certainly a lot more open, broader with that. I just wonder if you have any advice on almost like having a strategy for choosing collaborators. Do you just sort of spend the first few years keeping the circle small and learning the skills, or do you actually go all out and take advantage of any opportunity that comes along? I know that's an odd question,
yeah,
but
okay. I guess let me answer this in a couple of parts too. So the first one is the way I sort of personally conceptualize it is I like to see sort of sitting at a table, and it's like the concept of your table of mentors, right? You don't have one mentor. I mean, ideally, you should have several different mentors in several different areas. And that's how I like to see sort of the collaboration, right? You have your core group that you may always collaborate with. There may be another group that is similar and you sit on the fringes to that group and you interact. And there may be another group that may be more distant that you want to get into and work with or whatever. Or there may be other people in that. So having this sort of table of collaborators. The one thing that I have to sort of draw to early careers and any academics is don't get overly sucked into collaborations very early on in your PhD process. Simply because, remember, you're there for a purpose, right? Collaborations are time and effort that will take you away from that. 1 or 2 over the span of your PhD, I think, is good and healthy, and you start that ball. But also be mindful of what you can actually contribute, right? Because this collaboration is a two-way process. You are evaluating the collaborators, but your collaborators are also evaluating you as well, right? So I can share a very recent example which I had with a early career at my institution, who had very sort of very new and got into lots of collaborations, and that was great. And one of the conversations we recently had around this is that he was expecting X, Y, and Z from a collaborator, but that collaborator didn't really deliver on that. And so now he was sort of at this juncture whether, should I continue the collaboration because we're quite deep into it, or should I withdraw from the collaboration? And again, so you can see from this kind of episode that this person does collaborate, but the experience of this collaboration wasn't as positive. And as a result, he felt that he had just sort of wasted time and was now not on track. But we don't know what the other person was thinking of that collaboration, right? So I think there has to be a strategic element. Collaborate for a purpose, and that has to be really communicated. I think any sort of development of a collaboration, there's a pre-early stage where you sort of getting to know each other, understanding, even just sort of sussing out the person and saying, okay, what bodies of literature are you reading, right? Are we reading the same literature? Is it on the same level? Are you reading something else? Because if that early on you notice that intellectual divide is really big, then there's going to be a lot of effort to kind of bridge that. And I'm going to share a personal insight with this, and I shared this with Craig, and I think he wanted me to share it. And that is sort of one of my, as a scholar, we're always taught, or always now pressured by our institutions to form interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research. So I had the fantastic opportunity to do this, and what had happened, and I'll tell you the outcome and I'll go back to the process, is that I'm obviously in the social sciences, and I'm going to shamefully say this, I collaborated with a scientist. Nothing wrong with that. And we produced a piece of work which was very well received, very highly cited in a journal called Biological Conservation. So if you're in the sciences in biology and conservation work, this is their top kind of journal. And this collaboration, this publication that we had, really just focused on an under-researched topic and something that was really, really valuable to that particular field. And that was the issue of job satisfaction and burnout among conservation workers. And yeah, it's just lots of readership, lots of whatever you want to talk about it. How this process came about is really interesting, because I think there's a lesson learned in that as well. So we were both keen cyclists. We were cycling, we had a puncture, and we had to wait on the side of the road for a few hours until a friend got us. And we just started talking, right? Because we're both academics, we're from the same institution, but we have this out of extracurricular passion. And we started talking about, how much he is a conservation biologist, he's a conservationist, and how much his work takes him away from his family and stuff. And we started to talk about things like burnout and whatever. And I said, do you know any research that has looked at this population. He said, oh, no, nobody's ever looked at it. He said, oh, right, let's go off and collaborate. Very loose idea, right? All we wanted to do was just look at burnout and what causes burnout and job satisfaction in conservation biologists. So, and he said, oh, I have this really unique opportunity. He said in 3 weeks' time, there's going to be a conference in Malaysia on conservation and conservation biologists. A lot of conservation people were there, so we can collect data. We said, fantastic, this is, let's move at breakneck speed. And at this point, we'd never given really consideration as to where we would publish, how we would analyze. I mean, it would go against all the caveats of how you do research. Let's do a literature review and whatever. But, I had a firm idea of the variables that I wanted to collect, and he was okay with that. We were just interested in a population, to be honest. So we went and collected the data, and then that's where we thought, now this is going to be tricky. So I said, can you analyze this data? So we went off and analyzed it. And this is where things started to sort of, I wouldn't say go south, but you realize, oh no, what have I done? So we got a good sample. I think it was about 450 conservation biologists. So first thing that we realized is that in his field, regression analysis means nothing, right? Whereas if you're a psychologist like me, direction, significance, and all of that means a lot of things. P-values don't really mean much. Means and all that mean more to him. So he came back with this lovely data analysis, which he thought was fantastic. And I looked at it and said, I don't understand this. I don't see this in my field as being rigorous enough. And he goes, no, it's rigorous. And so there was a back and forth and all this. And we started writing the paper, and that even produced a lot of issues, right? Because how you write for a science journal is very different to how you write for a social sciences journal. We had only 2,000 or 3,000 words to work with, as opposed to 6,000, 7,000 words in social sciences. Hypothesis didn't really mean much. And, concepts and literature reviews and all this was different. So it took us like almost 10 months of just trying to figure out how we would work together to get this piece of paper done. And then it went to the review process, and eventually again, it went through another process and eventually got, accepted. But to me, I think the value of that was a couple of things. First, we didn't really set the objectives, right? We were so passionate about just collecting the data, and we thought it was a good idea. We didn't think about how this was going to work out, how we would analyze it, or where we would submit it. It was just, let's collect first and think about this later. So from that, I think being strategic about it, I mean, it was eventually something that was worthwhile because, we were friends anyway, so it made the process easier. But looking back on it, would I do that collaboration again? And the short answer is no. Because if I'm looking to collaborate, I think that was a great publication. It helped a lot, but it didn't really help my career much. It did take time away working on this, but it did teach me a lot of new stuff as well, right? But it also goes to show me that I needed to have more of an open mind when working with people from different disciplines. Now, this is quite different because this is not a sociologist working with a psychologist. I think there's sort of at least some sort of commonality, but this is a biologist working with a work psychologist, which is quite sort of different in that sense, right? So I think, yes, enter collaborations with an intention. Make that intention clear to everyone so that we understand, because you may want to collaborate and say this is good, but the collaboration may not be of the same value to other people, and that's okay. Be prepared to gain and lose collaborators along the process, right? And this is a tough decision that any team has to make as a collaboration. Who do we eventually include in it? And in some disciplines where you have very large groups of collaborators, not everyone may appear on the output, right? So they may have group A appearing first and then another output group B or whatever. So again, those things sort of need to be thought out a little bit. And thinking about the number of collaborations that you do is important, right? As you progress, you can later on develop more and more collaborations. And I think as your careers progress, it's more and more important to have collaborators just to keep the publications going and the output going and the analysis going as well.
So that sort of, you touched on the fact that if you were to redo that one, you probably wouldn't have done it again, which is, I guess, understandable in a way. Although I thought you said something yesterday about it being one of your more highly cited papers for some reason. So I'm like, there's a bit of a
Again, it's not
internal contradiction there, but
it's not. I'm looking at it from a process point of view. I'm not looking at sort of an output.
No,
The
that's cool. And that's sort of where I want to head to next. And if I can sort of throw two themes together, because I think they're going to come together in your answer. Looking at perhaps some of the pitfalls and the awarenesses we have with respect to collaborating, but also as we sort of look at what is good and what is bad about it, how do we also go about whether it's with, say, another one person or multiple people, but how do we really go about navigating the roles and responsibilities? And you've touched upon the fact that we each bring something different to the table. And of course, that changes the contribution, or that sort of guides the contribution that each party can bring. So how do we go about navigating that as well?
So the short answer and the easy answer is to set expectations quite clear. Now, I think before sort of getting into this, I want to just take a little bit step back and discuss something that was sort of included here. And that is when you talked about the purpose or the intent, it's also time frame considerations. What do you want to achieve with this collaboration, and how quickly do you want to achieve it? So like I sort of said in an earlier example, I have a collaboration now, and it's a very embryonic stage of collaboration. I will consider it with a colleague in our Ningbo campus. I have this data, like her to analyze it, and we want to get it published somewhere. That I think the roles and the responsibilities we're still working out, right? Obviously, clearly here, her responsibility and role is the data analysis. I've just provided the data and a framework for her to think about. But the equation changes when we start a new collaborative project that hasn't got anything, doesn't have data. It's maybe you and 3 or 4 people sitting together and say, we want to explore this topic. And then who's going to do the reading? Who's going to do the critical analysis? How are we going to discuss this? So at those stages, there's a lot of more uncertainty as the project gets in. And people may, like I said, join a project or collaboration, or they may choose to exit it at that stage. But I think there's got to be a point where you and your team decide, okay, we're now going to move from talking about this collaboration to actually collaborating. So I like to draw that distinction between the action of collaborating, which is where I think you're going towards, Craig, versus let's just get on a Zoom call or a Teams call or maybe over lunch or something and flesh out some ideas. That's just talk, right, at this stage. So once it starts to go into the action stage, there may be naturally one or two leads, and then you can discuss, and you can probably observe how you're going to deal with tensions. Tensions may arise, disciplinary tensions, for example. There may arise about how somebody reads or interprets a piece of work or literature, or how you kind of frame sort of research questions, or even, let's say, you're deciding on the methodology, right? How do you resolve those tensions? So who's going to be in charge of what? Now, these are more likely to occur in more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teams. But if your team is much more homogeneous, which you're collaborating with, so for example, all of you are strong quantitative researchers, then I think the question naturally answers itself, right? You're not going to have much tension on the choice of methodology, because you're already coming in with kind of a positivist paradigm. So trying to iron out those, but also not being overly strict about them. And I've been a part of collaborations where someone has said, you've got to do 30% of this and you've got to do 40% of this, and we can't really break up our time like that, right? Okay. But some loose guidelines about maybe who would have overall direction. What are the reasonable expectations of the outlines that you set? So, for example, do you work, are you expecting a person to complete work or pass it on to the next person? Or do you expect highly collaborative, you're doing it on Teams or whiteboard and everyone's putting it together? What do you kind of expect? All of these are sort of things that you need to be mindful of. I wouldn't say necessarily having a concrete guidelines. I think that makes the collaboration very rigid. But maybe as you go along and then you start producing more, collecting data, producing more and more, then maybe it's the time to put in a little bit more standards. Right. So you talked about roles and responsibilities. Many journals now actually ask when you submit as a statement who has done what and to what percentage. So again, that can cause a little bit of tension, but it's something to just sort of be mindful of and throughout the process. I hope that's answered your question, Craig.
Yeah, that has. I kind of want to touch on something, and I'm sorry this has come out of left field for you, but it's something I've just thought about. When we're perhaps working with people from either different institutions or from industry in particular, the issue of ethics and ethics approval is going to be something that's a bit challenging, because we don't. In my viewpoint, we don't put it down to, oh well, you'll just go through my institution and run it. What's been your experience with some of the ethics approval processes, and what sort of best practice advice, especially say, for example, if you're doing an academic and industry collaboration where the industry party may not actually have a robust ethics process?
So that's actually a very interesting question, because institutionally, almost all institutions have some sort of ethics process, and I think one sort of red flag is if you do have collaborators who ignore that. I think that's already you've got a red flag. In most best practices, and I think most institutions that I've worked with, as long as there is one ethics clearance from one institution, you generally just have to apply and show that it's been approved by another institution. Again, it's very institution specific, but it kind of happens like that. But the issue then changes dramatically when you go from, like you said, from academic institutions to industry, non-government, or even government institutions. So it's surprisingly that many government institutions don't have ethics policies. Right? But they expect an ethics statement.
Yeah.
But they may have much more stringent requirements into how things are collected and reported, which you have to sort of adhere to. So your institutions may actually appear quite lax compared to theirs. So the interesting there is that what does it mean for you in the collaboration? How best to navigate those? So do you go for the highest or most difficult ethical approval that you kind of approval process do you need? But again, this has to be evaluated on a one-on-one situation. So for example, industry, it primarily centers around privacy, right? It's not so much about things like, ethic processes. So as long as that, but for example, many institutions may have issues with, let's say, collaboration efforts or medical efforts that involve people under 18. Government organizations have it much more stricter in that sense when you're doing things like medical research or science-based research. So there's different lines that I think you kind of need to figure out. But again, a good collaborative team should bring these issues up, right? In a good collaboration, that they should be sort of fought and then decided on as a team, what is the best way to tackle it?
Fantastic.
Yeah. What was the other part of your question, sorry?
You addressed it all.
Oh, okay.
That covered it nicely. I kind of want to move into an area that you sort of touched upon a little bit, but is the idea of writing across disciplinary areas, so the interdisciplinary or the multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary research. And I'm just wondering, I know you sort of gave a story that was kind of the extreme in a way with that particular publication, but just in terms of how to navigate those waters of potentially working across disciplinary areas and what, I don't know, I almost want to say how to toss the coin and decide which direction it goes in, but I know it's of course a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, it is. And again, there's kind of no simple answer to this one. It's very much situationally dependent and collaboration and in which sort of and the type of collaboration that you're doing. So if you're doing collaboration that is purely for exploration and interest, then I don't think it's really a big issue. Right? Because you naturally would be going into a collaboration with a relatively with a relatively open mind, right? The point of that collaboration is exploration, and it is to obviously gain new knowledge yourself. But it becomes a bit more tricky when you're collaborating for a more narrowly defined purpose, such as, let's say, producing a report, producing a paper, or something like that. And I think it's very important here to sort of set the kind of, and I know I'm going to use very complicated to the epistemological boundaries, right? And to sort of agree on what are the sources that we're kind of looking at. So like there's some fields which are naturally much more cross-disciplinary in their approach. So one of the kind of fields that I could think about here is those related to human resource development, right? Because there's a field where a lot of the literature, a lot of the things is based on education, learning. It's based on human resources. It's based on development. It's based on leadership. So the literature bases are much more fluid in a way, and the knowledge bases are much more fluid. It's a different story, though, when you're talking about, let's say, economics and psychology. Right? There is conceptual overlap a little bit, but the fields become much more difficult. And so writing for that field. Now, each sort of discipline has its own way of expressing its voice. And, and the language that it uses. So that was one of the challenges that I faced writing for a science journal, is that long-winded explanations are not needed. They're very concise. They're very short in how you do things. Citing lots of literature, for example, is I think that journal only required 20 citations. So you have to be sort of very specific. And this is sometimes the limits of collaborative research, right? But overall, if you're looking at a more broader exploratory research topic that you're going to do the collaboration for, don't be afraid to say that the disciplinary writing will change, right? Depending on how you pivot or how you change the collaboration and the outcomes that are associated with it. I hope that answered your question, Craig, because it's a bit of a minefield to go into that one.
Well, I don't want to have a habit of asking easy questions. So yes, you did a great job.
There's one that I sort of want to, there's 2 points that I just want to sort of add here. I guess rising out is, first of all, it gets down to also what I call the politics of authorship. Yep. Again, it's something that you as a collaborative team have to sort of determine, and it's very much based on cultural norms. So, for example, I'm very well aware of a paper that was produced in a Journal of Economics, I think, and it says, "Are Chinese economists disadvantaged?" And what they've done is they've done this citation analysis of publications in top economic journals, and the answer was yes. Chinese authors are disadvantaged simply because the field has this unusual practice of alphabetically listing each author. Right? So you can't do anything about that, right? So unfortunately, if your name is Zhao, you're going to be at the end. It's just
it actually makes me think about one of the it's actually a North American practice with teaching hospitals and research that's done there. Within a teaching hospital, every staff member is listed on the publication, regardless of whether they contributed or not. And there's an example where there's 1,400 names on one publication. I mean, the list of names is longer than the publication itself. So we do have some weird cultural practices. I kind of want to come back to when we talk about working with our supervisor. There's a gentleman, a former colleague of mine from Auckland University, and I don't know if he's still there, but he was actually quite. University policy was your supervisor always had their name on the paper. That was an Auckland thing in the 90s. Okay. His policy was, well, you write the paper, but my name goes first always. And I kind of want to just touch upon a little bit of advocacy for what is fair. I know it's a cultural practice, and I'm probably slapping it in the face a few times because I think it should be in terms of workload more than anything else. But I do feel that as a PhD candidate, for example, we need to be equipped to advocate for ourselves, to make sure that we're not taken advantage of. In this particular gentleman's case, it was his way of getting first authorship on many things without doing anything. And to me, that was unethical, to quite a few of his students, of course. But it's really just about encouraging ourselves to be stronger advocates for the first authorship position as a PhD candidate. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
And also, just to put it this way, it's your work that is produced. If Sure, there may be intellectual contributions by your supervisor or whatever, but it's ultimately, if you've done all the writing, it's your work, it's your words, and that's what should be represented. But it also speaks to, I think, another sort of issue in collaborations, and we like to think about collaborations as ongoing. But there's nothing wrong, I repeat this, there's nothing wrong and probably quite healthy to eventually break out of a collaboration.
Yeah.
And you may enter collaborations in many different shapes or forms. So you may be asked to collaborate because there's a lead collaborator or a leader and you've just joined that group and been asked to collaborate to it. But a good sign of a healthy collaboration is over time, you gain that confidence, which is what part of the collaboration is, to break away and form your own collaboration or join another one where you have a different role. Because being in the same role in a collaboration is not healthy. And I'll give you a very unusual perspective of this, and I sit this because I sit on a number of hiring committees for the university, and I've come across on a number of occasions one or two individuals who've applied, and it's in a way where I've asked this question. I said, okay, what was your role in these output in these publications? And every time he said, my role was data analysis, data analysis, data analysis, and that is absolutely fine. But what becomes quite obvious is this individual had so much output that he just collaborated with anyone.
Yeah.
Right. And anyone who said, can you collaborate on this? Yes, I'll produce this and I'll produce this. And so we went from topics talking about SMEs to digitization of data to this, to this, to this, to this, and everything. And the question that the panel was left, so what are you actually applying for? Like, what's yours here? And they were dumbfounded by that question. They couldn't answer it. They just said, oh, I like to collaborate a lot. Okay, that's great. But where's you leading a collaboration, right? Where's you doing a different role in the collaboration? And every time his role was almost identical. I analyze the data. I analyze the data. Okay, fine.
I think that comes down to the fact that you're not developing as an academic. You're developing as perhaps a data analysis.
Yes.
But you're not developing the full skills that go into those processes.
So getting back to the question, I think about getting is that only doesn't apply to collaborations, but I think it's also a healthy part of any supervisory relationship, because that's a natural collaboration. So you do, you've got your span that you do your PhD, and then afterwards you collaborate. But there should be at some point, I believe, in the back of your mind saying, okay, how can I break out now? You never neglect your supervisor. They're an integral part of who you are and how you've developed. But there's also about now this sort of the bird leaving the nest in a way, right? Going to explore other opportunities. And you may continue and you'll collaborate and your supervisor may open up whole new collaboration networks, which were previously closed off to you, because you may have only been a student and now you're more advanced and whatever. So there's that possibility. So don't just feel that you're trapped into a collaboration. And I think that's what your example was earlier, those 2 or 3 people just constantly collaborating.
Yeah. I think when we sort of did our discussion yesterday about the themes, we just talked about being able to get out of the shadow of your supervisor as well, because you want to develop as a researcher yourself, not as Nolan, I'm not Mike's student. I'm Craig. I'm somebody who's capable on, on multiple levels as well. So I think it's the importance of that. I kind of want to go, I've got 2 more themes that I'd like to touch upon. One is, what advice, there's a lot of us here that are in the doctoral journey, probably about to go for their first or one of their first attempts at working with others. any advice for initiating a collaboration? Do we come with an idea, or do we simply just have a conversation and see
Um,
what
there's,
what
there's a
manifests, I guess.
there's a couple of ways. You know, conferences are obviously a very good way if you can get to a conference to meet others, especially after a session. You can bring a paper. I mean, you can bring your card or something like that. If you like somebody's paper and say, I'd like to talk to you more about this paper. What are the possibilities of exploring a collaboration? Also within conferences, there are specific sort of events, they have writing workshops and young career. So that's another meeting point as well. In terms of your connection, initiating it, I think going in with a bit of an open mind and just saying, can we explore the possibility? You don't want to force a collaboration on anyone, right? Yeah, they've got to wanting to join it. They've got to be something to pick. And, over my career, I've had many conversations that have turned into nothing. But we still have them every conference or every time we meet.
And not everybody likes to work with others.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And some it's also sometimes some people can just say, look, I'm just too busy.
Yeah.
I'm too busy to commit to this. I'm too busy. I'm already involved in collaborations. I don't take that as a completely negative. Some people just collaborate a lot. And to sort of develop their issues. So I think there's natural ways to sort of do this. Cold calling, I think, is a little bit, it takes it out a little bit. Sometimes dropping an email, would you like a collaboration? Received a few of those. I mean, a collaboration is I'd like to sort of meet you face to face. I'd like to sort of see what you are and stuff like that. I think
I got just as a funny story for that, I did get back when I first started the third degree, and we're starting to get a followership coming through in the first year, and I had this student message me, this PhD candidate message me, can we, are you open to exploring collaborations? And I said, sure. What do you have in mind? And know your collaborator, because the area of interest was early childhood education, which is ever so slightly different from the stuff that I talk about. And they saw me as somebody who was friendly and approachable, but they didn't really see it as, and to me, it was the weirdest cold call, because it was like, can we do a paper together on this? I'm like, I'm not the right person for you.
Mm.
So it is thinking as well. You know. So I have one.
part of it, yeah.
Sorry, what?
It's a bit that's the strategic part of it, right?
Yeah. So I have one last theme before I'm going to open the floor to those of us who are here. We typically talk about collaborations for publication, perhaps for data collection, and then it goes or gets used for different purposes. I just want to touch upon an area that I think I'm guilty of not talking about enough. We're mostly PhD candidates here, or early career academics. Many of us will go into the university system, will become educators. I want to just briefly explore the idea of collaborative teaching and getting some of that experience. And I know it's a little bit off skew for where we are, but I think it's also a great skill to develop, in the sense of being able to work with other people within our disciplines. And I just wonder if you want to add your own thoughts on that sort of process for PhD candidates and getting involved in teaching, either, a sort of session like we're doing now, or just contributing to a module in different ways.
I think the collaboration there is, I think that's more just contributing, but collaboration is using your disciplinary knowledge to come up with a new module. One of the things that, you know, many universities lack overall is diversity in disciplinary thought when it comes to teaching. So, for example, you know, leadership is only taught by somebody who does leadership, right? When leadership could be taught by someone who does sociology, someone who does ethics or philosophy and all of those. So engaging in those, and it can be richly rewarding. So it's not just about teaching, but co-creating content. I think that's where you're sort of pointing in that direction. It's a great way to sort of start the collaboration process, because remember that the person you are collaborating with may turn out to be a research collaborator as well.